I didn't even realize my hands were trembling until hers brushed mine. It wasn't a touch that demanded attention, just a passing gesture, a casual tracing of fingers, but somehow it left a trail of fire along my skin. "Break her heart for me," she whispered. I froze, caught somewhere between confusion and the sudden, impossible gravity of the moment. The words weren't meant for me, not literally, but somehow, in that low, knowing voice, they pinned me there. I was crouched by the front counter of the little repair shop I worked at, wiping a smudge off a coffee stain on the laminated surface. The room smelled faintly of machine oil and old paper, the fluorescent lights above buzzing softly, casting everything in a kind of lukewarm haze. And she leaned against the opposite side of the counter, arms crossed, posture casual, yet undeniably deliberate. The kind of casual that made every movement feel intentional. She had that way of looking at people, like she was measuring their weight in the world, but with a softness that didn't hurt. Not yet. Her hair caught the light, a warm chestnut with strands that refused to obey the straightener, and she tucked one behind her ear as she studied the receipt in her hands. I wanted to look away, but something in her eyes held me. Confident, layered, like she'd spent decades learning which pieces of herself to reveal and which to keep tucked away. It was intimidating and magnetic at once. I cleared my throat, trying to sound casual. Did you want me to?" I trailed off, my hands gripping the rag a little too hard. She raised one eyebrow, the corner of her lips twitching in a half-smile that made my stomach clench. No, she said, her voice soft but firm. "I've got it. But, thank you." She paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "You always notice the small stuff, don't you?" I wanted to tell her I didn't notice anything like she imagined, but the words lodged somewhere behind my teeth. Instead, I just nodded, and the silence that followed was oddly heavy. Not uncomfortable. It had weight, like something unspoken had settled over the counter between us. She shifted, leaning a fraction closer, just enough that our arms brushed. Not the fingers this time, our forearms. And just like before, it was electric. I couldn't quite read her, whether it was deliberate or incidental, and maybe that was the point. Her presence was a kind of challenge I wasn't sure I wanted to, or could, refuse. The bell above the shop door jingled, but I barely registered it. I was too focused on the subtle curve of her smile, the way her gaze lingered a heartbeat too long. She looked like she knew something I didn't, like she was playing a game and I had just been drafted into it without consent. My chest tightened with the realization that I couldn't stop watching her, couldn't stop thinking about her even as I tried to pretend I wasn't completely undone by her casual grace. She straightened, brushing imaginary dust from her sleeve, and for a moment, I thought she was leaving. But then she glanced back over her shoulder, that same layered, unreadable look, and for a split second, it felt like we were the only two people in the shop. I went back to wiping the counter, but my hands shook a little more this time. Not from the rag, not from the smell of coffee or oil, but from the tiny spark that had just ignited between us. And I knew, without fully understanding why, that I would replay that moment over and over. Her fingers brushing mine, that whisper, and the impossible weight of her eyes. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not for a second. The next time I saw her, it was behind the counter again, this time with a stack of invoices that looked like they'd been pressed into battle. I offered to help without thinking, and she glanced at me with that same layered look, equal parts amusement and caution. "Sure," she said finally, sliding a folder toward me. Her hands moved with careful precision, nails short, wrists flexing just enough that I caught the tiny movements. The way her fingers curled slightly when she held the papers, the faint tremor that betrayed her fatigue. I wanted to ask if she was okay, but the words wouldn't form. I didn't dare intrude. She sighed, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, and it felt like the room had shrunk around us. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the faint smell of coffee and old paper curling between us. She was quiet, mostly, and I found myself filling the silence with small observations. The slight crease by her eyes when she concentrated, the almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of her mouth when she caught my gaze. "Thanks," she said finally, almost a whisper. Her voice was softer than usual, vulnerable in a way that made my chest tighten. There was a hesitation there, a pause that stretched too long for just politeness. I sensed something behind her careful composure, a fatigue, maybe, or something older, deeper. I reached for the papers, letting my hand brush hers again, and she didn't pull away this time. Instead, her fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary, just enough that my pulse stuttered. I caught the faintest exhale from her lips, like she was trying to release a thought she wasn't ready to speak aloud. She laughed suddenly, low and restrained, at something I hadn't even realized I'd said. And it was a strange, magnetic sound, the kind that made the mundane paperwork around us feel inconsequential. I couldn't tell if it was genuine amusement or just a shield against letting me in too far. Her posture shifted, shoulders tightening, and she leaned back slightly, scanning the counter as though she might vanish into the stacks of invoices and folders. I noticed the subtle tension in her back, the slight dark circles under her eyes that spoke of long days or restless nights. There was an elegance in her weariness, a quiet insistence that she was capable, even when she seemed fragile. We worked in silence for a few minutes, the world outside the shop fading, leaving only the small, electric space between us. Each brush of our hands felt deliberate, yet innocent enough to pass unnoticed. I felt drawn to her in a way that made it impossible to focus on anything else. She paused, letting a folder slip from her grasp just enough for me to catch it. Our hands met again, and her eyes flicked to mine, not challenging, not inviting, just lingering, weighing. The air between us thickened with something I couldn't name, a charge that was neither spoken nor acted upon, but unmistakably present. "Careful," I said quietly, but my voice betrayed a flutter I couldn't hide. She nodded, eyes not leaving mine, a small smile tugging at her lips. There was an unspoken acknowledgement there, a delicate, forbidden understanding that neither of us could, or would, define yet. And then she turned, just slightly, brushing past me, leaving a lingering warmth where her hand had been. I could still feel it, humming on my skin, and I realized I would remember that gentle pull long after she'd gone. It was late, later than usual. The shop was nearly empty, the hum of fluorescent lights punctuated by the occasional distant rumble of a passing storm. Rain streaked the windows in slow, irregular lines, catching the dim glow of the street lamps outside. She leaned against the counter, papers scattered around her like leaves in a quiet wind, and I found myself standing too close, though I had no real reason to. "Do you think it'll hold?" she asked suddenly, her voice low, almost swallowed by the storm. Her hands rested on the edge of the counter, fingers brushing the surface, and I could see the faint tension in the tendons of her wrists. I wanted to ask what she meant, but something in her posture, guarded, careful, made me hesitate. I shrugged, trying to sound casual. "I think maybe. Depends." Her lips twitched, half a smile, half a sigh. She glanced at me, eyes lingering longer than usual, and I felt the sudden, dizzying pull of proximity. My own pulse kicked up, but I kept my voice even, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I couldn't let myself betray how much the sight of her like this, vulnerable yet poised, was unraveling my restraint. The storm outside swelled, a distant clap of thunder making both of us jump slightly. She laughed, a soft, breathy sound that didn't reach her eyes. I noticed the way she avoided my gaze afterward, brushing a hand through her hair, straightening the cuff of her sleeve. Small, mundane gestures, yet every one of them was loaded with something I couldn't name. "I should probably," she started, then paused, her words trailing off. The hesitation hung in the air, heavy and electric, and I caught myself leaning forward, wanting to close the distance, but staying frozen, my restraint tethered by some invisible cord. Then her phone buzzed, sharp and intrusive against the low rumble of rain. She glanced at it, and her face tightened just enough that I recognized it instantly. An ex, or someone she wasn't ready to think about right now. She swore under her breath, tucked the phone away, and the moment shattered like glass. I stayed where I was, silently cursing the intrusion, watching her push the papers into a neat stack, the storm outside a harsh counterpoint to the quiet tension that had settled between us. She moved a little too fast, briskly, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. There was a beat of silence, and then she looked up, eyes meeting mine again, but just for a fraction too short. That small glance said everything and nothing, an acknowledgement, a warning, a question I couldn't answer without betraying my own restraint. I wanted to say something reckless, something honest, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I merely leaned just slightly closer, careful not to cross the line, careful not to let my own hesitation crumble. The storm raged outside, indifferent to our unspoken tension, and the faint electricity in the air made my skin prickle. Her hand hovered over the counter, brushing mine ever so slightly as she passed me a folder. My heart slammed against my ribs. Not enough to touch, not enough to confess, but enough that I would replay that fraction of a second over and over, imagining what might have happened if we hadn't pulled back. She turned away, her shoulders straightening, leaving a small void I couldn't seem to shake. I stayed frozen for a moment, my hand lingering where hers had been, and realized that some things, the almosts, the near confessions, hurt more than anything actually spoken. We didn't speak for the first 10 minutes after she walked in. Not because we had nothing to say, but because everything we could say seemed too fragile to put into words. The shop smelled faintly of rain and old paper, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. I stood by the counter, hands in my pockets, watching her unpack a box of invoices like it was the most normal thing in the world. She glanced up finally, eyes sharp and tired, catching mine across the room. There was a long pause, a stillness that pressed against my chest, and then she said, almost as if testing the words first in her mouth, "What are we doing?" The question was simple, casual even, but it hit me like a punch I wasn't ready for. My throat went dry, and I had to step back to steady myself. I wanted to answer, but the truth tangled itself around my tongue. I don't know," I admitted finally, voice low. Her laugh was bitter, short, not amused. She leaned against the counter, fingers curling around the edge, knuckles white. "That's the problem," she said. Her eyes didn't leave mine. "We act like this is normal. Like, whatever this is, it's fine." I swallowed, noticing how the faint lines around her eyes deepened when she frowned, how her shoulders, usually so composed, slumped just a fraction. The vulnerability was brief, fleeting, but enough to make my chest ache. I wanted to reach out, to steady her, but I didn't. Because reaching out might mean crossing a line I wasn't ready to name. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered, voice barely audible over the hum of the lights. Her gaze flicked down for a moment, tracing the worn edge of the counter, and when she looked back, it was like she was searching for some answer in me that I didn't have. I stayed silent, because no words seemed adequate. I watched the way she exhaled slowly, almost painfully, her hands flexing on the counter. Every small movement spoke volumes. Hesitation, confusion, longing, fear. "I can't keep pretending," she said finally, each word deliberate, measured. "I don't know if I should be here, or if I should walk out and never come back." My stomach knotted. I wanted to argue, to tell her that nothing needed to be resolved right now, that we could just exist in the tension a little longer, but my voice refused me. Instead, I nodded slowly, letting the silence swell between us like water filling a vessel neither of us wanted to break. She leaned back, running a hand through her hair, and the movement was almost tragic in its simplicity. I noticed the faint lines of fatigue under her eyes again, the way her lips pressed together when she exhaled. For a moment, I thought she might cry, but she didn't. She just stared at me, unwavering, and I realized that our connection had shifted. The unspoken electric charge, the brush of fingers, the small glances, they weren't just fleeting sparks anymore. They were something dangerous. Finally, she turned away, shoulders rigid, and muttered, "I don't know if I can do this, if I can keep pretending I'm fine with whatever this is." And just like that, she left a void in the room bigger than any words could fill. I stayed frozen, staring at the spot where she had been, realizing that I had never felt more exposed or more helpless in my life. I found her in the corner of the shop the next morning, curled over a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving the streets slick and glinting in the weak sunlight. She didn't look up when I came in, just kept tracing invisible patterns on the counter with one finger. "You look tired," I said quietly, almost hesitant. My words felt intrusive, but I couldn't help it. I wanted to reach across the counter, to bridge the invisible distance, but stopped short. She finally glanced at me, eyes dark around the edges, a shadow I hadn't noticed before. "I didn't sleep much," she admitted. Her voice was soft, but there was weight in it, a kind of confession I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. I leaned on the counter, careful to keep my posture neutral, but my hands clenched subtly behind my back. "Bad dreams?" I asked. She shook her head slowly, brushing her hair from her face. "Not dreams, memories. Of someone I lost a long time ago." She paused, and for the first time, her defenses slipped. He just disappeared one day. No warning, no goodbye. And I kept thinking I could outrun the feeling, pretend it didn't matter. But it always does. I swallowed, struck by the raw honesty in her tone. I wanted to say something comforting, but the words felt too clumsy, too small. Instead, I reached for the stack of invoices she'd left half-sorted and began sorting them, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. "You remind me of him," I said finally, almost reluctantly. My voice was softer than I meant it to be, and I caught her flinch, just slightly. "Not in a way that replaces him. Just, you carry some of the same light." Her gaze lingered on me, sharp, and I could see the storm behind her eyes. The same one I'd glimpsed in fleeting gestures before. Her lips parted, and she looked away, brushing her fingers over the edge of the counter as if to anchor herself. "That's kind of cruel," she said softly, and I realized she was teasing. But it wasn't humor that made her voice tremble. It was the undercurrent of old grief and new uncertainty entwined together. I wanted to reach out, to reassure her, but I stayed where I was, letting her dictate the space. The quiet between us carried more than any words could. Her confession, my hesitation, the weight of memories neither of us fully controlled. She finally straightened, picking up the coffee cup and taking a slow sip. The warmth seemed to steady her slightly, but I could see it in the tension of her shoulders. She wasn't fully grounded. I wanted to anchor her without knowing how, wanted to close the distance between us, but the right moment kept slipping just out of reach. Then she turned slightly, her hand brushing mine ever so lightly as she moved the cup. That small, fleeting touch, innocent in intention, seismic in effect, made my chest tighten. I didn't move, didn't speak. I just let the moment linger, letting the memory of her grief and the fragile trust she was offering me settle into me. And I knew, somehow, that nothing between us would ever be quite the same. It was late again, the shop dimly lit by a single overhead bulb, the street outside empty except for the occasional passing car. We sat on opposite sides of the counter, sorting invoices in silence. Not the nervous, jittery silence of before, but one that felt heavier, more deliberate, as if both of us knew we were skirting some invisible boundary. I glanced at her, catching the faint tremor in her hand as she stacked a pile of papers. I didn't say anything. I just moved my own hand closer, almost brushing hers without intent. She froze for a heartbeat, then let her fingers rest lightly against mine. Not a grab, not a claim, just a quiet acknowledgement. And that was enough. She sighed softly, eyes on the papers, but I could see it in her posture, the weight lifting slightly, her shoulders loosening. "I don't want to pretend anymore," she said, voice low, almost swallowed by the hum of the shop. "I don't want to lie to myself." I nodded, carefully, deliberately. "Then don't," I said. No grand speeches, no promises, just those words, simple, true, and enough for the space between us to shift. We worked together for a while, not speaking, hands occasionally brushing over invoices, sharing small movements. Each contact was electric and tentative, measured, and yet felt inevitable. It wasn't about passion or rush. It was about recognition, about the quiet understanding that had been building between us for weeks, months even, and finally refused to be ignored. She leaned slightly forward, her forehead nearly touching mine, and I didn't move away. The warmth of her presence was grounding, a tether I hadn't realized I needed. I felt the subtle exhale of her breath, the small rise and fall of her chest, and something in me finally let go. The tension, the hesitation, the quiet fear of crossing lines. We didn't speak, and we didn't need to. Every glance, every barely there brush of fingers, said what words couldn't. We existed in the same space, fully and without pretense, letting the quiet pulse between us be its own declaration. At some point, she adjusted the papers and ended up sitting on the edge of the counter, her leg brushing mine. I stayed on the floor by the counter, hands resting near hers, letting the proximity settle naturally. There was no rush, no dramatic confession, no sudden move. Just the inevitability of us being here, now, finally aligned. I caught the faintest twitch of her lips, a smile, maybe, or just recognition of the same thing I was feeling. Her hand shifted slightly, brushing against mine again, firmer this time, just enough that the contact lingered. I didn't pull away. I didn't need to. We sat there for minutes that felt like hours, each aware of the other, each silently agreeing without saying a word. The invoices were half forgotten, the world outside irrelevant. Nothing had changed about who we were, nothing about the shop, nothing about the quiet chaos of life, but everything had shifted in the small, precise acknowledgement of this moment. Finally, she leaned back slightly, exhaling, and I realized that the impossible tension between us had resolved not with a declaration, but with quiet presence, with acknowledgement, with understanding. And that was enough. I think about that night a lot, even now. Not because anything monumental happened, not because we shouted our feelings from rooftops or tore the world apart with declarations, but because of the quiet we shared. The kind of quiet that settles around you and makes you realize that being seen, truly seen, is sometimes louder than any words. She's changed in the ways I can't fully articulate. The tension in her shoulders has eased. The careful distance she carried like armor now worn only when necessary. I see her laugh more, fully, sometimes without noticing herself. And I've changed too. My own hesitation softened, my attentiveness sharpened, the way I notice the smallest details in someone who matters becoming second nature. Love, I've learned, doesn't always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it comes like a quiet pulse, a brush of fingers, a shared glance that refuses to be ignored. And sometimes the moments you almost miss, the pauses, the lingering hesitations, are the ones that define everything. We still work together sometimes. The shop still smells faintly of rain and coffee and old paper. But now, when our hands brush, there's no tension to avoid. There's recognition, there's trust, and somehow, that small, simple acknowledgement carries more weight than any grand gesture ever could. I've realized that the most profound connections aren't always loud. They don't always announce themselves with fireworks. Sometimes, they exist in quiet spaces, in shared silences, in moments you almost don't notice until you look back and realize you've been holding on to them all along. And maybe that's the point. That love, real love, doesn't need perfection. It needs presence. It needs patience. It needs courage just to stay, even when nothing spectacular seems to happen. I catch myself smiling sometimes, thinking of the way she leaned back on that counter, the faint twitch of her lips, the warmth of her hand brushing mine. It's a memory that's never dramatic, never overwhelming, just quietly, painfully perfect in its ordinary, human way. And I think she feels it too, in the way she lets herself exist a little closer now, in the way she allows the small gestures to linger. Not everything about us is resolved. Not everything is predictable, but everything that matters is quietly, undeniably real. So here we are, not in a fairy tale, not in a whirlwind, but in the gentle afterglow of something earned, something human, something that stays. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?